Greetings everyone, Shalom. In this video I will discuss the vegetarian verse found in an old Syriac copy of Luke known as the Evangelion Da-Mepharreshe. I believe that's how you pronounce it. And I've already made 2 videos about this, but some new research has come to light. Also, Cameron Waters, my friend, the filmmaker who is responsible for the wonderful documentary Christspiracy, was on Myth Vision with Derek yesterday, and he shouted me out and actually talked about my videos regarding this subject. So I wanted to delete the other 2 videos that I have and make a new one that is a combination of both of those videos and try to do a better job. So here we go. So Yeshua taught abstention from flesh and alcohol in the Gospel of Luke. For me, this is the most important verse in the Bible for Christian vegetarians and teetotalers because it comes from a canonical gospel, the Gospel of Luke. Okay, this is not from any extra canonical source or apocryphal source, so-called. This is from a canon gospel. Okay? So in a very old Syriac copy of our Gospels from the 2nd century AD, most likely, I'll explain that later, the dating, called the Evangelion Da-Mepharreshe, we read in the Gospel of Luke the following message from Yeshua. Be on guard, so that your hearts do not become heavy with the eating of flesh and with the intoxication of wine, and with the anxiety of the world, and that day come upon you suddenly, for as a snare it will come upon all who dwell upon the surface of the earth. So here, Yeshua is giving us a warning. He's telling us to be alert, be attentive, be vigilant. You don't know when death will come upon you. You could die tomorrow. So be vigilant, be alert, be on guard. Okay? So that your hearts do not become heavy with the eating of flesh and with the intoxication of wine. So in previous videos I have explained why I do believe Yeshua was vegetarian, why I believe the Essenes were vegetarians, John the Baptist was a vegetarian, and Yeshua's disciples were vegetarians. There's so much proof, so much evidence out there, so I don't want to go through all of that again, but go back and watch some of my previous videos, and please watch Christspiracy, of course. To learn more about Christian vegetarianism, I also recommend the books of Keith Akers, in particular Disciples and The Lost Religion of Jesus, both very good books that go into great detail on this subject. But of course we know that James the Just, James the Righteous, Yeshua's brother, was a vegetarian. We're told from the patristic fathers, the early church fathers, that he was a vegetarian from birth. And we know that some of Yeshua's followers were vegetarians. Paul says as much in the letters and the canon. Okay? And we know, of course, that the Ebionites were vegetarians, etc., and that the Essenes followed a Pythagorean lifestyle, we're told by Josephus, which means they were vegetarians. And, of course, all these groups were opposed to animal sacrifice. That sort of goes without saying. Please go back and watch my last video, that God never desired blood sacrifices, to learn more about that subject. There's plenty of evidence in the scripture, in the canon, to prove that irrefutably, in my opinion. So Yeshua was vegetarian. He did not think we should be eating flesh. Yeshua really came to restore the original religion, the original tradition, and so he was a reformer and a restorer. And part of what he was doing was trying to restore the original law of Moses that I believe is best exemplified in the so-called Shapira scroll, okay, the original scroll of Moses, the original Deuteronomy. So read Ross K. Nichols' book, The Moses Scroll, if you want to learn more about the original 10 Commandments. But essentially, Yeshua was trying to restore that original tradition, that original religion, the original law, before it had become so corrupted. And part of that law is thou shalt not kill. And for Yeshua and for the early proto-Christian groups, primitive Christianity, early Christianity, the original disciples, the Nazarenes, Ebionites, and so on, part of their message, part of their path, part of the way, as it was originally known, was abstention from flesh and abstention from alcohol. Okay, so Yeshua was a vegetarian. He believed that part of following the way, part of following God's law, being an obedient follower of the Lord, and the way was to abstain from flesh consumption. It was not just stopping animal sacrifice, but also ending our consumption of flesh. He was trying to bring back the Edenic ideal from the Garden of Eden. In the book of Genesis, of course, God gives us very clear instructions about our diet, and it is really a vegan diet. We're to eat fruits and vegetables and seeds and plant-based diet, a plant-based diet, okay? So here, Yeshua is warning us against eating flesh so that our hearts do not become heavy. What does it mean to have a heavy heart? Well, in the Jewish tradition, it really meant to be going down the wrong path. Okay, and go back and watch my video about the Didache, the two ways of the Didache, the way of life, the way of death. So if you want to follow the way of life and you want to live a righteous life and feel good, feel pure, feel righteous, feel holy, feel close to God, part of that is to abstain from flesh consumption and also alcohol, or really any addictive substances that lower your vibration, lower your frequency, lower your consciousness. So to have a heavy heart really means to have low consciousness, to be trapped more in your carnal nature, your animal nature, rather than your spiritual nature. So Yeshua was always trying to get us to be to raise our vibration, raise our frequency, raise our consciousness, to live with that Christ consciousness that he had. And in order to do that, it's really important to follow certain guidelines. And one of those guidelines is to not eat flesh. It's also good to practice ritual immersion or baptismal purification in the living waters regularly, frequently, and to fast as well. I'm about 55 hours into a fast right now, feeling pretty good, and definitely recommend to fast regularly, at least once a week. Go 24 hours without food, bare minimum. The Ebionites were doing that twice a week, and we know from their texts and from the Didache and all of that. Okay, so don't eat meat, don't drink wine, and don't worry too much. Okay, everything here is temporary. This too shall pass. So don't get too trapped in anxiety about the goings on this tiny little planet. Okay, the universe is huge. What goes on here isn't the be all end all. Okay, don't worry too much about what's going on. Try to unplug, disconnect from the news, from current events, and all of that when you can, and do digital detox as well here and there to refresh the mind and purify the mind and the heart. So here we have the redacted modern variant of Luke 21:34 that we find in our Bibles today. Be on guard so that your hearts are not weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of this life. Okay, so here, flesh or meat consumption has clearly been removed by the lying pens of the scribes from the original text of Luke to appease a wider audience of flesh eaters. All right, so whoever changed this verse, whoever redacted this verse, was attempting to appeal to a wider audience, okay, of flesh eaters, people who are not as familiar with these guidelines that the Nazarenes, Ebionites were following. All right, and so flesh consumption has clearly been removed, redacted by a later redactor. Okay, so I believe that Yeshua could have been quoting from Proverbs in that verse in Luke. In Proverbs 23:20, we find the verse, "Do not be among wine bibbers or among gluttonous eaters of meat." So it's highly possible, probable in fact, that Yeshua was quoting from this verse. He quoted from Scripture frequently. So it's quite possibly that he was quoting from this verse in Proverbs, warning us against hanging out with drunkards and meat eaters. All right? So be careful the company you keep. And, it's best not to go to a lot of barbecues where folks are cooking a lot of meat and, getting drunk and wild and all of that. Okay? Be on guard. Be vigilant. Be alert. Be aware. Okay? Keep up with your religious life and your spiritual practices so that you do not get weighed down with a heavy heart and lower your vibration, lower your frequency, lower your consciousness. Okay? So the Curetonian Gospels or Curetonian manuscripts, they are fragments, Syriac fragments dated to the 5th century, but they used a Syriac alphabet. I don't know how to pronounce this, so sorry. Without vowel points that dates to the 2nd century. So we know actually that this Syriac manuscript goes all the way back to the 2nd century, and it preserves an earlier form or an earlier Greek than the later Greek manuscripts, such as the Codex Sinaiticus and the one from Alexandria, and some of these early Greek manuscripts. This Syriac actually preserves an older Greek variant than the later Greek manuscripts. I know that's confusing, but I assure you it's the case. So why is this verse so important? Well, because it's a direct quote from Yeshua himself. All right? It's from a canon gospel, the Gospel of Luke, not from any extra canonical source or apocryphal text. It's from an early manuscript using Syriac from the 2nd century, meaning that it originated in the 2nd century, was based upon older Greek copies that it was translated from. It preserves an earlier Greek source than the version of Luke that we use today. It was removed by scribes who were worried that it would offend the sensibilities of non-Jewish Christian readers unfamiliar with the Nazarene Ebionite practices of the abstention from flesh and wine. Okay? So it's a direct saying attributed to Yeshua himself and recorded in a canon gospel. Okay? It's irrefutable proof that Yeshua was a vegetarian and teetotaler, did not drink alcohol. All the other evidence we have comes from historical sources talking about John the Baptist, the disciples, the Ebionites, and their diets, but not the diet of Yeshua. In other words, the other evidence that Yeshua is a vegetarian is based upon well-reasoned, educated speculation, but not based upon anything Yeshua specifically taught or said in the canon Gospels. So this verse really changes everything, y'all. It's a big deal. Okay? So for all my Christian vegetarian friends out there, this is really hardcore proof, hardcore evidence that we ought to be using as we educate others about Christian vegetarianism and the fact that Yeshua and his disciples were all vegetarians and that they inherited a vegetarian tradition from the Nazarenes, this subsect or subgroup of Essenes. Okay? This is very, very important. So, I believe that this verse could be from Special Luke, otherwise known as L, which is what we call the verses in Luke that are not found in Mark or Matthew. Okay, so Luke used several sources for his gospel. Mark, of course, Q, most likely, whether it was oral or written down, and the Hebrew gospel. Okay, Special Luke comes primarily from the Hebrew gospel because it includes many Semitisms and Hebraisms. There are parallels of a similar verse in Mark and Matthew, but they don't mention dissipation, carousing, drunkenness, flesh, and wine. They're really not parallel verses. This is a unique verse. Scholars that try to point out that there are parallel verses in Mark and Matthew, it's really flimsy. So this is a unique verse to Luke. Okay, and everything that we find in Luke that does not come from Mark or Matthew, we can say it comes from a source known to scholars and academics as Special Luke, or simply capital L, all right? And in Oh, and by the way, for folks that say, oh no, the Gospels were just channeled directly from God, it's the Word of God, inerrant, infallible Word of God, and that these Gospel writers didn't need to use sources because they were witnesses to the, et cetera, et cetera. We've heard all the apologetics from fundamentalists. Um, well, Luke says he used sources. In the first chapter, the first few verses, he explicitly states that he utilized various sources to write his Gospel. So I don't know what to tell those folks, really. And so the Hebrew Gospel is known by many names: the Gospel of the Ebionites, Gospel of the Hebrews, the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, etc. It's the same book. It's the same text. Okay. So 24 early church fathers and other sources attest to the existence of this gospel and 10 preserve quotations from it. I believe we have about 50 verses or so preserved. We don't have a copy of the Gospel of the Hebrews. This is an issue. Hopefully someday we'll discover one. But it certainly existed and was widely attested, and many early church fathers saw it, read it, even translated it. And so we know it existed, and we have many of the verses preserved from it, okay? So we know it was around. So I really encourage everyone to read James Edwards' book, The Hebrew Gospel and the Development of the Synoptic Tradition, to learn more. It's really a masterpiece. I just finished it, well, about a month ago. And it's one of the best books I've ever read about early Christianity. And so I encourage everyone to go read it. And the Hebrew Gospel predates the 4 canonical Gospels. And as a matter of fact, they probably used it as a source. I'm convinced Luke used it as a source because it's so full of Semitisms and Hebraisms. Okay, what does that mean? Well, the other Gospels don't really have nearly as many. Luke has, 10 times as many as the next closest, which I think is Matthew, if I'm not mistaken. Or it might be 30 times as much. I don't remember. But read James Edwards' book. Okay, he explains it in great detail. It's a little bit dense. It's hard to get through, but I think you'll really enjoy it. And so he goes into great detail, and he shows, beyond the shadow of any doubt, that Luke used a lot of Semitisms, which means that these are typical Hebrew language sayings and everything that got transliterated to Greek, essentially, but maintain a lot of their Hebrew character and nature and grammar and syntax and structure and all of that. All right, it's very complicated. So I'm not going to try and explain it, that's for sure. So read James Edwards' book if you want to learn more about that. But Luke certainly used the Hebrew Gospel as a source, most assuredly. And so special Luke, or L, this source that Mark and Matthew did not use, Luke certainly used. And I believe it was the Hebrew Gospel. And that's what James Edwards argues in his book very eloquently. Okay, so this is the book. Definitely get a copy. Check it out. So in his book, he seems to think that this verse, the entire verse, was full of Semitisms. So the whole verse, a lot of the verses, he pulls out, he just finds a few Semitic features here and there, a little bit of sort of vestigial Hebrew, as it were. But in this verse, he seems to think the entire verse was full of Hebraisms or Semitisms, which means that the entire verse could have come from special Luke, L, which he argues was the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Hebrew Gospel. So why is that important? Well, because the Hebrew Gospel predates the canon Gospels. So in other words, if Luke was utilizing the source, okay, and this Syriac variant, or Syriac manuscript, early, of Luke preserves the verse from the Hebrew Gospel directly, then we can say that this verse is incredibly early, extremely early, okay? And so it preserves something from the original Gospel of the Hebrews, which was the original Gospel. Gospel is written in Hebrew, not Greek, okay? And most early church fathers, rather, attribute the writing of the Hebrew Gospel to Matthew, Yeshua's disciple, his direct disciple, Matthew, they claim, and they claim to have knowledge about all this, wrote the Hebrew Gospel in Hebrew prior to the 4 canonical Gospels. It's the earliest Gospel. It's the first Gospel. It's the original Gospel. Okay? So we have a very early Gospel being written in Hebrew, okay? And then translated into Greek first, of course. And then those earliest Greek manuscripts, okay, were translated into Syriac. The Syriac preserves that original Greek, which was based upon the original Hebrew, you see. So what we have here in this verse from Luke 21:34 is most likely, in my opinion, 100% likely, an original saying of Yeshua. And by the way, before I go on, another reason for thinking that the Syriac preserves earlier Greek than the later Greek manuscripts is that the Syriac did not have to pass through as many hands, okay? And so when you do textual criticism, you want to look at internal evidence and external evidence. Well, external evidence has to do with, the reliability of certain scribal traditions or groups of scribes that were translating texts or copying texts, okay? For example, the scribal tradition in Alexandria was very strong. And so if something, comes from Alexandria, it's considered a little bit more reliable by scholars and so on, all right? Well, the thing is, Greek was a far more popular language, and so the manuscripts of the Gospels passed through way more Greek hands, and those Gospels were copied far more times, far more frequently, which means that they had far more opportunity to be changed, redacted by scribes. Okay, so the Syriac copy, on the other hand, was not passed through nearly as many hands or scribes, and therefore it is far more likely that it was able to preserve more authentic, original, earlier variants of these manuscripts, okay, than the later Greek manuscripts, you see. And so the fact that the Syriac from the Evangelion Da-Mepharreshe did not pass through as many hands because it was written in Syriac, you see, and not Greek, to my mind, ensures its validity as a very authentic, early, genuine, reliable source for Yeshua's sayings, more so than the later Greek manuscripts that we find in the Codex Sinaiticus and others. All right. So here are some Semitic features from Luke 21:34. Be weighed down, your hearts. It's a very unusual Greek syntax, literally, your hearts be weighed down. So the Semitic parallel in Hebrew and Aramaic, it's common to use the heart as the seat of thought or moral burden. Okay, so we have examples of Hebrew idioms like lev kavod, which means heavy heart, from Isaiah. This passive construction plus the heart as a moral spiritual seat lends itself to let us believe that it is a typical Semitic thought pattern. Okay. Another example is this triadic warning: dissipation, drunkenness, and cares of life. Of course, that was changed. It should be flesh consumption, drunkenness, and cares of life. This triple construction mimics Semitic parallelism common in Hebrew prophecy and wisdom literature. Okay, and so this word, cares of life, is also echoed in Luke 8:14, showing Luke's consistency in drawing on idioms about life's anxieties, often paralleled in Semitic thought. And there are others, but I don't want to get too into the weeds here. Okay, yeah, we already talked about that. And so something else I discovered, just on my own, just using intuition, I thought, well, I wonder if that word dissipation, that the redactor obviously inserted, an obvious insertion, replacement for flesh consumption, I wonder if that word that the redactor chose is common in the 4 canonical Gospels? If so, well, that doesn't, that's not great for our case here, because it could be that, well, maybe that's the original, maybe the Syriac actually changed it, and so the original was dissipation. And so I was thinking, well, but what if that word is rarely used in the 4 canonical Gospels and seems out of place? It doesn't fit, it doesn't match with the rest of the language of the 4 canonical Gospels. Then that would be very good for our case, okay, and proving that it was, in fact, a replacement, a redaction. And lo and behold, I did some research, and the Greek word used for dissipation is krepali. Krepali. I'm just now learning Greek, y'all, so if my pronunciations aren't perfect, forgive me. So that's the Greek word for dissipation. Guess what? It's the only use of that word in all 4 canonical Gospels. Never used again in any other example within the 4 canonical Gospels. Therefore, it's an obvious redaction, an obvious replacement or insertion. Okay? It's out of place. It doesn't fit. It doesn't match with anything else in the Gospels. Therefore, it's highly likely that whoever changed this verse chose a word that was not common in common usage at the time, and that proves that it was not the original, that the original was flesh consumption. Okay. Furthermore, the meaning of this word, krepali, has to do with a hangover. Okay. So this is another piece of evidence that we can look at because it's redundant. Okay, hangover and drunkenness. Typically, in these triadic warnings or whatever, you wouldn't have 2 words that have a very similar meaning. It's redundant. It's like a repetition. Okay, and typically repetitions over time, scribes tend to correct those. There's so much evidence about this. I don't want to go into too much detail, but you can read Bart Ehrman's book, Misquoting Jesus. He goes into this a little bit. But duplications and repetitions tend to be corrected over time by scribes as they're correcting the texts, okay, and redacting and all that. So this was left in either due to scribal fatigue, so-called. Scribal fatigue is when a scribe is redacting, changing things, but they are tired or they become lax or lazy or lackadaisical, and they accidentally leave some clues for us. Okay, so I see this as possibly due to scribal fatigue, but it's certainly a clue that this was not meant to be in there. Okay, because it is a duplication, it's a repetition of 2 words that have or could be somewhat synonymous. Likewise, another mistake that the scribe or redactor made is to put the hangover before the wine consumption. So I don't know about y'all, but I quit drinking when I was 28, I'm 45 now, so I don't remember very well, but I'll tell you this, I do remember that usually you get hungover after you drink and not the other way around. So it doesn't make sense to say hangover and then drinking alcohol, drinking wine. Okay, you would say drinking wine and getting hungover. You wouldn't say getting hungover and drinking wine. Okay, so he got it out of order. Whoever the scribe was, whoever the redactor was, did not put this in the proper order. It doesn't make sense logically. Okay, so we have the fact that it's a very uncommon word, seems very out of place. Okay, and likewise, it's out of order. Doesn't make sense logically to put getting hungover before drinking. All right. So In some cases, scholars have proposed that the Old Syriac readings may reflect a Greek vorlage or underlying text that predates later standardizations. For example, due to unique wordings or omissions or additions not found in later Greek manuscripts, alternative ordering or phrasing of sayings of Jesus. So these are sort of context clues that scholars use to when they're comparing manuscripts, doing textual criticism, to try and determine which manuscript is earlier or more authentic or more genuine. All right, and so many scholars have observed the fact that the Old Syriac does oftentimes preserve an earlier, more authentic, more original form or variant of a text. All right, so it's a bit complicated, and again, I don't want to go too into the weeds, but it does seem that this Old Syriac version of Luke does preserve an earlier Greek than the later Greek manuscripts, again, because it didn't have to pass through as many hands, right? Syriac wasn't nearly as common, and the early Christians spoke far more Greek than they did Syriac. Okay, so it wasn't, it didn't pass through as many hands, and so it was able to preserve its authenticity and originality. So I'll give you a few examples found in the Old Syriac Gospels. These variants sometimes differ from the Byzantine, Alexandrian Greek text traditions. Okay, I'm not going to go through a whole lot of this, to tell you the truth. Y'all can pause and read through these if you want. But this one's interesting here. For example, from John, he who believes in God, the Old Syriac is he who believes in God, but the Greek manuscripts read he who believes in me. So this variant shifts the focus from belief in Jesus to belief in God. And so, the more original, authentic would be Yeshua always directing people back towards God, believing in God, right? And not necessarily him. So he was always trying to point people back towards God. He even says in one of the Gospels, why do you say that I'm good? The only one that is good is God. So he's always trying to direct people back toward the worship of God or to follow God and not necessarily himself. Of course, he always referred to himself as the Son of Man, not the Son of God, and all of that. He was very humble. And so it seems that the Old Syriac preserves the more original, authentic variant rather than the later Greek manuscripts. Okay, but there are many examples, but I don't want to spend too much time on all that. So we know that John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, so we know he was a teetotaler. John the Baptist, he was also a vegetarian, and I've made other videos about this, so I don't want to spend too much time, but the later scribes corrupted the fact that John was vegetarian. They said he ate locusts, but actually is a scribal error, and the words for locust and locust beans, or carob beans, carob pods, it's very close. In the Greek, it's like one letter of difference, and so it's a scribal error. And we know from the patristic fathers that John the Baptist was definitely a vegetarian and all of that. Okay? And he also did not drink wine. We know the Nazarites did not drink wine. Okay, that was one of their Nazarite vows. And I believe that the Nazarites did have some things in common with the Nazarenes, although they do come from different roots. Nazarite means something like to separate, to divide, to split off, because they separated from the larger Jewish population, because they wanted to have a more ascetic lifestyle and grow closer to God and all that. Nazarene, the root means something closer to observers or keepers, keepers of the way, keepers of the law, keepers of the tradition, something like that. But I do believe they had some things in common, and they did abstain from wine. Samson, of course, did not drink wine. Okay, he was a famous Nazarite, taking the Nazarite vow. Eusebius also states in proof of the gospel that all the apostles abstained from meat and wine. Other church fathers also echoed this sentiment. So we know that the disciples, Yeshua's disciples, did not eat meat. We know from so-called apocryphal texts about Thomas that Thomas did not eat meat. We know from the church fathers that James the Just did not eat meat. We know from Paul's own letters that some of the disciples and followers of Yeshua did not eat meat. This is very clear. And of course, the Nazarenes and the Ebionites, we know, were vegetarians from their own texts, like the Clementine Recognitions and Homilies and all of that, right? So from St. Augustine, we see that James, the brother of Jesus, lived of seeds and vegetables and did not accept meat or wine. Again, meat and wine together. Meat and wine together, all right? Meat and wine, meat and wine, meat and wine. So they go together. They go hand in hand, okay? So Origen of Alexandria was teetotaler and vegetarian, and he often fasted for long periods of time. Okay, so a lot of the early church fathers, really the who's who of the early church fathers, were vegetarians and teetotalers. Keith Akers goes into great detail in his books about all that. This is a great verse from the Recognitions, part of the Clementine literature, all right, Ebionite texts. And so they're talking about the Bactrians, who were Indians. There are likewise amongst the Bactrians in the Indian countries immense multitudes of Brahmins, who also themselves from the tradition of their ancestors and peaceful customs and laws neither commit murder nor adultery nor worship idols, nor have the practice of eating animal food, are never drunk, never do anything maliciously, but always fear God. So here, they were praising these Indians. That's one great thing about the Ebionites. They're very open-minded. They also praise people from, I believe they called them the Seres, which were Chinese people, basically. People from the East, okay? And so they praised them because they said, well, they live a righteous life. They don't commit adultery. They have good customs, laws. They don't worship idols. And they don't eat animal food and are never drunk. Meat and wine, they go together for the early Christians, right? So alcohol lowers your inhibitions, and you're far more likely to crave flesh and have other so-called sinful desires when you're intoxicated. So you're far less likely to obey God's laws and to be a good, obedient follower of the way if you're drunk or inebriated. Okay? So we have to stay vigilant. I quit drinking because I unfortunately had to watch my cousin die a very slow, painful, awful death due to organ damage from alcohol consumption. He died when he was 35. He was like my brother, my closest friend, my best friend. So it's one of the great tragedies of my life. And I had quit drinking prior to that, but when all that went down, that was it for me. And I have other family members who are alcoholics. It's very sad to watch people go through life like that. It's not a good way to go through life. Okay. And I'll share a little story with y'all. I was at a wedding, about 12 years ago or something like that, and maybe a little bit longer than that. Anyway, it was in Dahlonega, Georgia, where I used to live, and before moving to Chile. And I was at a wedding, we were at the after party, and I was talking to this lady, really nice lady, and she was telling me that she had been a vegan for 10 years. She had not eaten meat in 10 years, and we were both sort of complaining that there weren't many veg options at this after party, okay? But she started to drink pretty heavily. And I saw her about 2 hours after that, kind of hiding in a corner, eating fried chicken and ribs, pork ribs. And so, again, she had confided in me that she was a vegan for 10 years, and she was very upset that there was no, vegan options at this wedding party and all that, and lamenting it and everything. But she started drinking heavily. Once she was intoxicated, she decided to be all right, be a good idea to eat some fried chicken and ribs. And I'm not judging her. I'm not perfect. I slip up here and there with my vegetarian diet. Okay, I've talked about this in previous videos. I do a pretty good job. But hey, you know, I slip up here and there. But whenever I do, I like to do some ritual baptismal purification in the living waters to repent and atone, because I do see it as quote unquote sinful. Okay, you're disobeying God's law when you eat flesh, right? Period. So you ought to repent and atone when you do something like that. So pray, you know, and pray for strength and all that, and discipline. At any rate, so they go hand in hand, alcohol and flesh consumption. That is why this verse from Yeshua, from Luke, is so important, and we ought to follow his advice to be on guard, be vigilant, be alert, be aware, okay? So that we can be good followers of the way. What does that mean, or what does that look like? Well, we're more loving, we're more kind, we're more generous, we're more compassionate, we're more selfless, and caring, and obedient, and humble, all right? So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please share it with like-minded souls. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already done so. Lots of love, many blessings.